Set 13 Into the Arcane is finally out. Not only was it the usual chaos of learning a new set, but also a B patch came out, and I think Mortdog is out $500 or so.
I will give away $500 if we have to B patch the first patch, and it's not bug related.
Not only that, augment stats have been removed from the game, so I think a lot of people feel lost. So let's go ahead and dive into the TFT Academy tier list so that you feel like you have all the tools that you need to succeed on launch week. Before we go into the tier list, let's go over our launch week playbook in just 4 steps. Point number 1 is that the set mechanic anomalies is going to create a bunch of Exodias. Anomalies should be viewed as like a 4th item or 4th augment that basically makes the tank unkillable, the carry deal way too much damage, fights the snowball out of control, so on and so forth. And because everyone's trying to do this, it kind of creates a really big arms race towards the end of stage 4. And that leads into point number 2, which is lose streak is therefore very risky because if you're at low HP, you could just run up into some people who have powerful Exodia combos if you aren't actually clicking the right anomalies and you're also at low HP. I know a lot of players who, if they aren't getting any momentum early game, they lose 1 or 2 fights, they just sell a bunch of stuff aggressively for econ. And that's pretty risky because unless you know exactly what you want to play and roll for, you're going to take so much more damage and it's not worth the economic trade-off versus holding those pairs, getting those upgrades, and winning some rounds to turn your momentum around. Point number 3, here are some of the best early game boards to get you started. I personally really love the Conqueror board for AD. Draven is fantastic with like the Rage Blade, the Last Whisper, things like that. And Violet can hold those melee items. For AP, I really love having Lux Zyra with Sentinels because Lux does so much single target damage and Zyra also is very good. And then fighters, if you get like the Bloodthirsters, the Hand of Justice, things like that, really good with family, and you even have some bonus parts about it like Powder can hold some AP items. These are generally the 3 best openers that people are playing around right now. There's obviously more boards that you can play early that are powerful, but this is just a starter pack to help you get off your feet. And then the last point is always try to take an econ or augment first at 2-1 because you'll find that your game curves so much more smoothly than taking combat at the very beginning of the game. Are going to be some combat augments that if you are very well versed with a composition, you know you can take, but it's a significant trade-off because a lot of people are going to get further ahead with item or econ first. Before we start, I want to give a quick breakdown of how to understand how we framed each tier. S tier are things that are basically just overwhelmingly powerful and should be the first candidates get nerfed. These are the 3 comps that you should be considering to play every single game you queue in. Even though they do have things like these emblems, you don't necessarily require them to be played because they're so powerful at a baseline level that they can compete even if you don't have the ideal conditions. A tier are comps that are very good. They can actually compete and even beat the S tier comps, but they do have something that ties their condition down and you really need to have like a good start for it. B tier are things that are pretty situational. They can do well, but it's pretty rare that you're in a spot for it. And then C tier are comps that we just think are kind of weak and they probably need to get buffed. But if you want to have fun or maybe specialize in some really exceedingly rare reroll comps or tempo lines, then you can try to go for it. And then X tier are the situational comps. A lot of these are going to be hero augments and trait unlocks. As a general recommendation, I would stay away from a lot of the hero augments until they get buffed because they are going to struggle against a lot of the S and A tier comps. But if you do want to have fun, here are some variations that you can play, which you can explore, but we're not going to cover in this video. Starting off the very top of S tier is Black Rose AP Flex. Black Rose was so dominant at the beginning of the set that pretty much every lobby had 5 or 6 Black Rose players per lobby, and it was entirely correct. And that's because Black Rose just requires you to play half your comp as Black Rose units, while the other half can just be whatever you want. So there's a ton of variations that you can play. This variation that we have that's most powerful is the Visionary, Malzahar, and Heimer combination, where you play 5 Black Rose and 4 Visionaries. There's another variation you can play where you can play 5 Black Rose and 4 Form Swappers. Then you can play 5 Black Rose and 4 Dominators, and then 5 Black Rose and 4 Sorcerers. You're starting to see the theme here. And it's actually kind of nice because that gives you so much flexibility on your core roll down where you can just roll for the 5 Black Rose units and go for Zoe 2. You can go for Cassio and Silco as a duo. Or if you are high rolling, you can get the Malzahar and the Heimerdinger online. Personally, I think Malzaheimer is the strongest duo in the game for the AP. Ends up capping your board extremely high. And the really nice thing is that Malzahar actually has Shred built in. So you can focus on just having power items like having the Archangels and blue buff on the Heimerdinger, and then have Malzahar just provide some utility shred. So things like the Spark and the Shiv are lower priority. They're still good to have later in the game, which is why we have it like on LeBlanc here, but you don't have to rush it. But a lot of times what you do early game is prioritize the Heimerdinger items first. You go for like Archangels and then blue buff, but a lot of times you can't get blue buff, so sometimes you go like Shojin or Adaptive. Maybe go for like Shojin Nasher, some kind of combo. You might be wondering like why we have everything with like the double emblem, but that's to drive home the point that you just want to build as high as you can with Black Rose always. Black Rose emblem is basically just giving you a free team slot, like a Tactician's Crown, so it's very powerful. And you always play 5 Black Rose because each ability that Scion gets is really powerful. 4 Black Rose makes Scion get very tanky and also give you damage amp on your Black Rose units. And then 5 Black Rose just makes Scion like a second life, which is just insane. In terms of augments, just think about things that always synergize really well with the Black Rose and whatever your backline unit is. So for example, when we're playing Heimerdinger and Visionaries, you really want to gain a lot of mana, and mana flow works better with Visionaries because Visionaries are giving you additional bonus mana. So mana flow is actually buffed. So a very powerful synergy there. And then if you take things like Piercing Lotus, because it again gives you like the ability to crit and a little bit of shred, very, very nice. You often also want to take Econ as well to help get you to level 8 because the comps are very expensive. So you definitely want to have a high economy, and combat's really powerful as well. So make sure you get a lot of strong combat augments to help your AP damage. Your anomaly priority is always going to be Heimerdinger and then maybe Malzahar and Elise. The second comp that you're going to be seeing the most is Sentinel Heimerdinger, where you play an unkillable frontline of 6 Sentinel, and then you play an Academy / AD AP backline with Heimerdinger and potentially Corki. If you guys remember, 8 Bastion from last set, or even in set 10 Remix Rumble, where you would play Sentinel KDA Ari, this is actually extremely similar to Sentinel KDA Ari, where you have just, an unkillable frontline that's pretty cheap to build, and you have an infinitely scaling backline AP carry that every time they cast, they get stronger, and you get a Hextech Gunblade to heal the front line. Extremely similar concept to that. Very powerful with things like Little Buddies and Sentinel +1, and of course, Mana Flow. The nice thing about this is that you can actually hedge into AD. A lot of times when you play this comp, you're always wondering, oh my gosh, what do I do with a bunch of bows, gloves, and swords? Well, Corki actually fits really nicely because you get Academy through Ezreal, Leona, and Heimerdinger. And that lets you also play a Corki backline to just take over leftover AD. And that helps you hedge in case you end up going against, a bunch of people that build Dragon's Claw and try to build a bunch of MR. You actually have some shred there. I personally like Frontlight Jace in 6 Sentinel when you're playing for the Academy because you really just care about stalling. You could go Jace in the back line. I personally think that maybe the highest cap is actually to cut Corki, put the 80 items onto Jace instead, and put the Hextech Forge in the back. But this is just so much free HP. Jace 1 summons this Hextech Forge, and then when it dies, it revives. It's basically like 2 target dummies onto your board, which is reminiscent of, going back to Remix Rumble, kind of like playing an Alawi. The 5 cost, they give you the tentacles. Jace is kind of like another variation of that with the front line. So it's very nice. Gives a little bit of utility stun. And you also can play around the Academy items, which are always really fun. Stall, make sure you hold every Sentinel, make sure you roll down, play Heimerdinger. Heimerdinger is extremely good, best 4-cost AP carry in the game, and everything else is basically playing for a second. If you want to play another variation, this is like a Malzahar variation that you can play with only 4 Sentinels. If you want, you can play 4 Visionary, 4 Sentinel, but don't feel like you have to play this. You can also play Malzahar Heimerdinger with also the 6 Sentinel frontline. The last of the S tier compositions is Family Reroll. Family is a really fun reroll composition that, of course, it's the arcane season, so you get to reunite the family, relive the experience, or maybe break some rules. You get to put Vi-in with back in the family and maybe work through some of that childhood trauma, or maybe do some forbidden things. Maybe family and Silco. I guess the world is your oyster. Either way, I think the best variation to play Family Reroll right now is around Violet and Draven as a duo carry, because you get to play around Pit Fighters. Pit Fighters are very powerful if you end up stacking vertically because it gives you a big amount of healing. That 40% healing is kind of like Dawnbringers from the set 5 Revival. If you played that, you just get like a ton of extra HP, and that ends up being very good for survivability. They also buff Violet a ton on the B patch, so now she is the best primary carry to play around, and you have her duo with Draven. Violet's best slot items are fighter items, so Hodge, BT, Titans, just anything that is really good synergy with melee carries. And then Draven holds like Last Whisper, Rageblade, Giant Slayer, just like all the extra stuff. You don't really prioritize powder items at all. She just takes whatever's left over and you scrap her at the very end, but she can actually randomly pop off. Just don't rely on her as your primary source of damage. Vander ends up taking a lot of tank items only because it's really hard to get too many of these type of items. Vander's best in slot, I think, is actually also basically a second copy of Vi's items, but you just don't really get that very often. Darius can hold the family item early and then move it off to like a Vi 2 or Savika 2 later. There's also a variation where you can play around ambushers and watchers, but I think that 6 pit fighter is generally really strong, particularly because if you get the anomaly on Violet and you roll down to 4-star Violet, it's very, very good. I think the 2 anomalies I would recommend are the 4-star Moonlight one, as well as Miniaturize, that gives you a ton of stats, and you can actually just transform like a cheap pit fighter that's 2-star already, or something else that's like, you know, Conqueror, so you get a bunch of extra stats on it. You might be wondering if you can play like the hero augment variations of this composition, like gloves off Vander, or maybe I hope this works, but they are B and C tier for a reason, so just be very careful. I don't think they're very good, so I'd rather just play this variation instead. At the top of A tier, we have Scrap Corki. Silver Scraps, in case anybody are Game 5 League fans, because this composition can be pretty clutch sometimes. The really nice thing about Scrap is that you pretty much just love taking item augments, like always. Item augments actually turns into combat power because every single component that you have on a Scrap unit converts to shield for the team, which is really, really nice. And so, you know, you want to stack as many items as you possibly can. So if you ever get a start like Buried Treasures, or you're playing in another portal, which gives you extra items, always think about Scrap in the back of your mind. Sword items go on Gangplank and Corki. They want like infinite swords. There's also an augment that says sword overflow and you just get 5 swords. Also pretty good. And you end up going for IE, Last Whisper, Shojin, things like that. Rumble and Echo are your AP carries. They're both very good with AP. In fact, I'm pretty sure best in slot Rumble is 3 death caps. I've played that game like that and I crushed everything. Make sure you always buy Rumble upgrades if you possibly can. It's always worth it. Don't try to greed your economy. It's very good if you get a Rumble early. You're always going to go for 6 scrap, and if you get 2 scrap emblems, you can go for 9 scrap, which is always worth. Very, very powerful. The priority is always try to go for something that amplifies Corki and his ability to deal damage. So you want to look for attack damage on Corki. But sometimes if you're going for like Gangplank 3 and, you know, Corki's really contested, you can't find it, just maybe put something on Gangplank as well to give him the anomaly buff. The item priority is going to be the 80 champions though before the AP. Just give them whatever leftover AP you can hit. And all the best scrap components are shown so you can convert them into full items. And just make sure that you always keep extra components. Sometimes you end up in a situation where you're playing scrap and you slam all your items and then you only have like 2 components left to scrap. That is a little bit inefficient. Try to make sure that you're always mindful of what items you want to keep remaining to scrap. One augment interaction that we're not entirely sure about is whether or not item collector actually counts for the converted scrap items. I've heard mixed reports on both. So for now, definitely try it out and let us know maybe in the comments if you've actually seen it work and you can count. But I've had some people say it does, and then I looked at it myself and it looked like it didn't. So I'm not entirely sure on that one. The second vertical we want to talk about is Rebels. Rebels got a pretty huge buff in the B patch and is quite a versatile composition. There's actually a couple different variations that you can play of Rebels, depending on what you're hitting. The most important thing to remember is that when you're playing Rebels, you want 7 Rebels because you get a bunch of stats and you get a stun to the entire enemy board, which is huge. You do an AoE board by stun guaranteed, and that can swing fights. You also get a bunch of combat power, which is also really nice as well. And 10 Rebel, by the way, auto wins the game. It's the best vertical in the game. It's probably even better than 10 Enforcer, although both of them are just averaging like a 1.1, so you pretty much win. I don't know who wins between 10 Rebel and 10 Enforcer. I'm assuming it's 10 Enforcer, but maybe 10 Rebel actually can do it as well. The 2 main carries in Rebel are Zoe and Jinx. Zoe is AP and a higher mana cost sorcerer. It's important to note because in the past sets, you would always put blue buff on Zoe because she was like a 30 mana, 40 mana champion, but now she's 80, so Shojin is better. And then you want to stack her with a bunch of AP after that so that when she bounces, it'll end up doing a bunch of damage. Jinx is the other carry in Rebel, and she does a bunch of AoE. You basically want her to cast to her 3rd Death Rocket as soon as possible. The first does some damage and stuns them. The second does like a little bit of AoE. Then the third casts a giant rocket and AoEs everything. And if you give her AD and get Ambusher online, she can crit and sometimes wipe out the enemy board. And then you also remember that the bounce shots from Zoe can and also do a little bit of AoE. So now you're kind of connecting the Zoe Jinx AoE to wipe enemy backlines and then whittle down the tank. This is a very, very obnoxious time to go up against because you can't dodge Jinx and Zoe reliably. So if you're able to get online, it is very, very good. There's also another variation that you can play that we don't have up yet, where you can go for Ezreal and play around him as the AD primary alongside Corki. But that one's a little bit more niche, so we don't have that up right now. That's also probably around like a B tier comp. So always take Rebel emblem. We're not entirely sure about Paint the Town blue. This one is pretty underwhelming, but we'll keep it on there for now because it just kind of helps make your rebels a little bit better theoretically. But always consider that you want the mana items for these backline units and play for Alawi 2. She's a really, really important part of this composition. If you are stuck on like Irelia 2, set 1, and no item Alawi or no Alawis at all, you're going to be struggling a lot. Camille Reroll is a composition that I think a lot of people are going to argue is actually S tier. This is probably one of the compositions that's most likely to improve depending on how well it's optimized. And that's because I think this is one of the compositions that people are abusing the most with things like artifacts. Like we figured out that Sylvanmere Dawn is insane on Camille, as well as the anomaly. The anomalies we mentioned before early in this video, like miniaturize, for example, is incredible on Camille. And you just put like, you know, a bunch of combat stats onto Camille and she just can't die. Like I'm pretty sure Biss would be the miniaturized item, Sylvanmere Dawn, and Hand of Justice. She just becomes really hard to deal with. Ambushers are basically the assassins, or at least functionally the assassins. They get a bunch of crit strike chance, except they just don't jump to the back line. But Smeech can jump in the back line. He leaps to the enemy with the fewest items, usually a backline unit, or maybe someone in the front without any items. And Smeech ends up doing some huge amount of burst damage and maybe assassinates some very crucial units in the back. You can technically play around this with positioning, always be farthest away from Smeech, or you can put some bait items away from your corner unit so Smeech doesn't get to the back line. Because even if Smeech is just autoing the carry, they can do a lot of damage with the crit strikes. You're going to be rolling on 6 for Camille 3 and pick up all the extra Smeeches, then level to 7, roll for Smeech 3, and then later in the game add things like Alawi, Loris if you want, or other units if you see them fit. The other variation of Camille they want to show is Camille Famille, which is basically Family Camille. It's a fun little ambusher variation where you reroll Camille 3 with Violet 3. Another way you can play Family if you want. I think it's not as consistent as the baseline Family, but I've seen some pretty crazy power spikes with this board as well. Same thing, Anomaly Priority Camille, and give her the Family Emblem. Experiment Twitch Flex is probably one of the most fun comps in the game if you love playing AD Flex. It's very open-ended. You play Twitch, Mundo, Urgot, Nunu, Zyra pretty much always, unless you have an Experiment Emblem. And then you just pretty much make it work with whatever leftover traits. A really common secondary carry, for example, is Corki, because he's an artillerist that combos with Urgot. So you kind of have that. And then might as well just tie in Gangplank, who is a pit fighter, and that links to Urgot. And it turns out that he's a scrap and a form swapper, so he connects to Corki and Elise, and Elise is a bruiser that connects to Nunu, right? So it kind of creates like a cool little fun trait web scenario. Oh, and of course, Caitlyn is a sniper. You always want to make sure to have 2 sniper if you possibly can. Twitch's best in slot is Rageblade plus AD. You really just want Rageblade, Deathblade, IE. Runins is also good. Giant Slayer is fine. I think Last Whisper is a little bit less important on Twitch because, well, one, you get extra form of Sunder from Urgot for free. You can see that 20% Sunder is all enemy hits for 6 seconds. So that's nice. It gives you some time to stall. You don't need to prioritize Last Whisper as quickly. But also because I think Twitch just wants to deal burst damage. Whenever he gets the 8 attacks and he just shoots the piercing bolts, he really wants to try and do a bunch of damage. And Last Whisper is nice utility, but doesn't actually add that damage. So when you do pick an anomaly, you want to prioritize it on Twitch, give him a bunch of AD sources, or you can actually have a Mundo tank a lot of damage as well. I've seen people go for high HP Mundo or health regen Mundo and make him very, very difficult to deal with. There's a ton of variations that you can play of Twitch Flex, so just have fun trying to make sure that you have like a balance of frontline and backline with 2 sniper and 5 experiment. And the really cool thing is that I think this composition is the best AD Fast 9 legendary board. So if you're looking for an AD composition that you can play a bunch of 5 costs in, I'm pretty sure it's just 5 experiment plus, Caitlyn and Jace and Mordekaiser and Malzahar, right? They all have traits that tie into this board. So go ahead and just throw in those 5 costs once you get to 9 and profit. Enforcers are another really powerful vertical to consider in the A tier, and it's pretty much just gated off of having an Enforcer +1. Whenever you do, aim for 8 Enforcer, and you just get pretty obscene amounts of HP and damage amp. It's just very, very hard to deal with. Enforcer emblem is pretty flexible. You usually want to put just like upgraded units, so Rumble, Mbessa, Savika, Jinx. You can really justify a lot. The nice thing is that if you do have an Enforcer emblem, it's really easy to take a trait unlock at 4-2 and spike in power. So if you have like Martial Law, for example, Caitlyn and Mbessa, put the Enforcer emblem on Mbessa, and now you have Mbessa with Twisted Fate with Quick Striker, which can be really powerful. If you get something like Reunion with Vi Echo, you can have Vi and Echo hold it. If you get Unlikely Duo, you can even just slap in Jinx Savika and have a lot of success with Savika and Jinx doing a ton of damage. Camille, for example, is the ambusher that links to that Jinx. So you have a lot of options at your disposal. Definitely experiment and have fun with it. Pretty basic vertical. Have Maddie in the early game hold items for Caitlyn. Try to develop items for Vi, and it'll be like a Caitlyn Vi Enforcer duo, and watch some hot Vi Caitlyn action. Sorcerers are quite good, but this one is probably the most flimsy A tier composition because if you don't hit 8 Sorcerers and you're stuck on 6, it's pretty poor. And you do tend to struggle with frontline. But if you do get a good frontline, then this composition actually ends up being quite good. The situation I find myself playing Sorcerers the most often is when I get like a target dummy, because that just gives you extra frontline tank. And then I don't feel like I'm playing just 2 units in the frontline. If I play Swain Vlad and I don't have Black Rose on, it's just 2 units. And you're just like, what? But Elise can also go in the front line as well. They did nerf Elise's backline damage, so maybe this is a little bit outdated. You want to put Elise towards the front. Nami 3 is a pretty reliable carry. It's kind of similar to Cassiopeia for Dominators, where if you have Nami 2, she can actually keep up with like a Zoe for a while, and so it kind of feels bad to move items from a Nami 2 to a Zoe 1. And then as you're rolling, you might pick up like more and more Namis, and you still haven't found Zoe 2. By the time you finish Zoe 2, you might have like 7 Namis, and you're like, might as well just go for Nami 3, because you're rolling for all of this on 8, because you need to get to 8 Sorcerer as soon as you can. And so that's how a situation where you end up in Nami 3. It's not like you're trying to 100% always hard force Nami. I mean, that being said, we did say slow roll above 7 for Swain 3 and Nami 3. That is also a possibility that you can play as well. So those are 2 different game plans that you can go for. I personally think that the comp spikes when you hit 8 Sorcerer. 6 Sorcerer is okay, but once you get 8 Sorcerer, the abilities reduce their target's damage. It's a really big effect. So I like getting it online as soon as possible. Oh, Anomaly, by the way, probably is best on frontline as opposed to the backline because you lack so much frontline. But in some rare scenarios, you might end up going for a backline instead. At the beginning of the set, Kog'Maw was an absolute terror. He actually got nerfed pretty heavily because he was super oppressive even at 2-star. He mainly plays a Watcher frontline, and then you roll at 7 for a Kog'Maw 3, Scar 3, and Scar ends up healing a lot because of the Firelight trait where they dash and then they heal a bunch of burst HP. So when you start stacking a Scar, it's very difficult. Scar becomes evasive, and then he stuns, and then he heals, and then he casts again. And they're just like Firelight boogie boarding on your board, and you're just tilted. And then Kog'Maw has infinite range. He's just doing his Kog'Maw thing, ramping up, gaining a bunch of attack speed, just completely dumpstering everything. Kog'Maw Biss is Rageblade, Archangels, and Gunblade, but if you can't find Gunblade, just give him another damage source, or maybe even Shiv. Shiv is also totally fine, because I believe Shiv procs Automata, which is kind of nice. Automata says that when you deal damage, you do like a magic burst, plus 25% of the damage dealt, so it ends up being like a double cast, and it helps Kog'Maw burst through things. I think the best augment by far for Kog'Maw is Trifecta, because you basically just buff the 3 cost, so you're buffing Kog'Maw and Scar, and you can choose somebody else if you want, but those are the only 2 units you really care about. Always take a Watcher +1 as well, because the 6 Watcher could be easier to hit, and you'd probably put the Watcher on the Echo. You can also take a Firelight emblem, by the way, and put Firelight on Garen, and watch Garen do some fire surfing. I will say that this composition has been less impressive since the B patch hit, and I wonder if this composition actually falls to B tier by the end of the patch, because I think that there's spots to play it, but unless you have like a good start for it, I don't think you're supposed to force it. And a good start means like you already have a Kog'Maw and you already have like items close to it. If you have like a Kog'Maw but you have like belt, sword, cloak, like I probably wouldn't go for it. Oh, and Kog'Maw wants like attack speed stuff for anomaly like Dragon Soul or Thousand Cuts, things like that. The last of the A tier compositions is Conquerors. This is probably one of my favorite verticals because it just feels really fun to play if you snowball. The more ahead you are, the further you get ahead because Conquerors gives you reward chests for winning. So it's kind of like Sugarcraft. You want to play it from ahead. It's not like a cash out mechanic that you want to lose streak with. That's Chem-Baron. Conquerors instead really want to compound the issue. So if you love playing tempo and kind of keeping that win streak, Conquerors are super fun. And it's also pretty versatile, I'd say. A lot of people choose to put Gangplank in the back, but the reality is you can pick any backline unit that kind of combos with what the Conquerors are going for. He just happens to be a pit fighter that ends up being good with Vi, but you could also choose to play Dominators. Let's say you end up heading a bunch of AP items. You can play that and then connect it to Mordekaiser. You can also connect it to Visionaries as well and conquer a Visionary. You can also play it on Sorcerers, right? So you actually have like a bunch of different sources of not just the AD, but also the AP. I would prioritize melee items first if you're playing Conquerors because that's just generic. You know you kind of always want to play into some of those pit fighters. But if you end up slamming like AD or AP items, that's also fine. It's very open-ended, honestly, as long as you're just win streaking. In fact, you probably have to change this early game comp, put these items on Violet 2 because she is a beast. You definitely want to play around Violet 2 if you can. In terms of the other comps on the tier list, I'm going to cover two that I like in particular and leave the rest for you guys to research. One is the Chem-Baron Cashout. This composition is B tier solely because there's a lot of spots where you think you can get away with it, but you really can't. But if you do end up in a spot where you can cash out this Chem-Baron, lose streak a bunch, and then cash out a 400 to 500 shimmer, you will win the game. It is so powerful. All those items that you get are way overstated, and you pretty much just attach the item to whoever it's recommended for. So it'll tell you, you know, Silco, Renata, Savika, so on and so forth. The important thing with Chem-Baron Cashout, one, of course, is lose streaking. Take HP augments like, you know, Tiniest Titan, Titanic Titan, so on and so forth. And then the other is that you probably want to build 2 items on your carries and your tanks because that way you have a free spot for the actual shimmer item. If you have 3 items, let's say you build like, you know, Deathcap, Shojin, Nashor, Silco, and you get like an item or 2 for Silco, you're gonna be pretty upset. So make sure you just like hedge that you don't over index and just keep yourself pretty open-ended. Silco and Savika cap you the highest, but sometimes you hit stuff for Renni and she also just goes absolutely haywire onto the enemy team. And the other thing too is when you cash out, make sure you always have 3 Chem-Baron in, otherwise you lose the item. But you could also just keep all your Chem-Barons as well because you get HP for each black market you pass. You get a bunch of HP on your team. So I've seen people just keep 5, 6, 7 Chem-Baron in, totally fine. But you can also go down to 3, play a bunch of 4 and 5 cost, and also win the games. Pretty much an embarrassment of riches at that point. The other composition I want to talk about in the situational tier, I said I wasn't going to talk about any of them, but there's one that I think is outstanding, and I think that's Renni Reroll with the Brutal Revenge. The tricky thing is that it's a 3-cost hero augment that you can only get on 3-2, and if you do end up getting it, you want to try to pivot into Renni as the primary, and you don't even need to play the Chem-Baron Cashout whatsoever. You just play a basic 6 bruiser, backline AD. In this case, it's Gangplank because it's just easy to connect them to Trundle and Elise for the Form Swapper and the Scrap. But it could be anything, really. So just, you know, make sure that you have some kind of backline threat. And Renni's actually quite good if you can get her to 3-star. All right, so those are all of our comps for launch week, including the B patch. What do you think? I'm pretty sure a lot of these comps are not fully optimized, but, you know, this helped you get starting point and help push you along the path because I know that a new set can always be overwhelming. Let me know if you guys have any tech in the comments below, whether it's a composition, an item, or a trait combo, or maybe even some anomalies that we aren't even considering. That's it for me this time. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.